November 2022. This is the meeting of the Audit Committee of the Isle of Wight Council. Those who don't know me, I'm sure everybody does know me. I am Councillor Andrew Garrett, the chairman of the committee. We are a little light on numbers today, but we are indeed quorate. So, and hopefully we will stay that way. I have had an apology from Councillor Peace, and that he won't be able to attend, and an apology from Councillor Price, who will be attending late, but he's had an urgent family matter to deal with. So obviously that's a very acceptable situation to be in. There are no changes in membership. So I will move on to just explaining that there is no planned fire drill this morning. So if you do hear the fire alarm, do treat it as a real emergency, evacuate the building via the nearest safe escape route, down the stairs to your left as you leave the council chamber, exit via the door at the back, walk across the inner car park to the evacuation point, which is the pavement opposite the police station. Do not use the lifts in that emergency situation, and do not re-enter the building until you're advised it's safe to do so by a member of staff. Everybody also will be aware that the meeting is recorded. I'm sure is popular amongst some people on qualified to go through our business. So I've dealt with apologies already. Minutes of the previous meeting, members who were here last time will recall it was a fairly swift meeting. Are they accurate and record? And are you prepared to accept those? Yes, they are. I will just initial and sign. Item number 3 on our agenda, declarations of interest. Are there any interests to declare? It does occur, of course, occur to you at any point during the meeting, just shout out and I will record those. Public question time. Do we have any written questions submitted? We do not. There is no one in the public gallery, so I assume there are no public questions to deal with. Item 5 is the council's financial position. Has the board been able to join us? I asked for this to be put on the agenda because, of course, the council is in as indeed all councils across the country are in very difficult situations, and these are in my time on various councils. These are, I would say, unique circumstances, and so I thought it would be helpful as an audit committee for us to have an understanding both of the council's financial position, but also in how that should be considered and influences the decision making that will take place over the next few months, particularly around the budget. Because of course, whilst there is no risk, as I understand it, of this council getting into those sorts of difficulties that other councils get into, I understand that those councils, there has been commentary around the way in which their audit function has looked at things like this. So I thought it was helpful that we should have that view. So if Mr. Ward is there, coming through the ether to us. Mr. Ward is out at Tennyson Down, judging by his background. I believe that's Tennyson Down behind you there. Yes, it is. So, Mr. Ward, the room is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just have a moment to try and set the presentation up? So I might go funny on screen just for a couple of seconds. Right, okay. Can you all hear me?
We certainly can.
Thank you. Okay, so obviously, thank you for the invite, Chair, and I'm grateful to you for that and happy to present today. I'll be fronting the presentation, but obviously, if I get any difficult questions, then hopefully I'm aided and assisted by Kerry, who's here with us today as well. So what I thought I would do is I thought I'd take you through the original forecast. So just a reminder of where we were when we set the forecast. This is for next financial year, but obviously I'll as I go through, I'll also talk about implications arising in the current year that also have an implication for next year. So remind ourselves where we started from, then talk a little bit about what's changed, because obviously when we set the original forecast, this was before the conflict in Ukraine. And it was before we entered into this hyperinflationary environment. I'll then talk a little bit about some of the forecast budget pressures that are emerging, largely because of the inflationary environment that we now find ourselves in. Then I thought I'd touch on what happened in the autumn statement. So the autumn statement gives us a clue of the extent to which we might get some government support for all of the pressures that the council has been facing, but we don't actually find out the real detail of how that trickles down to individual local authorities until December. So probably not until about the third week of December. So we can't give you a definitive statement of where the council is at the moment because of that degree of uncertainty. And then I'll try and bring that together in terms of where we are right now in the overall financial position, but bearing in mind that at this stage we are at an early part of the budget process, so we're doing the normal work that we would do at this point in the year to work through the budget preparation of budget savings, evaluation and scrutiny of all of the potential budget pressures that the council may face next year, and we're constantly refining as we go along. Then I'll summarize that and then just talk about what our plan is going forward, taking us up to budget day itself. So if we wind the clock back, take you back to the point where we were setting the budget, and just to remind you about what the forecast for next year looked like when we prepared this nearly a year ago now. So it was back in January that we were finalising this work, and we reported it to council obviously in February. Excuse me. So just as a reminder, at that point, the council's forecast was for an overall deficit of £6 million over a 3-year period. But we were saying at that stage that that deficit could vary by plus or minus 3 million. And the main reasons for that were that there was a significant degree of uncertainty about what future funding from government might look like. We were looking forward to the Fair Funding Review, and we were also faced with what's called a business rate reset, both of which could have had significant implications for the council's funding. In annual terms, what that meant was that given that it was a 3-year deficit, so in 3 years' time, the council needed to have its net expenditure £6 million less than it was currently, we were looking to find that incrementally at £2 million per year over the next 3 years. Specifically in relation to next year, 2023-24, some of the bigger assumptions that were in our forecast, and this will come into contrast obviously as I go through the rest of the presentation where we can reflect on what's currently happened. But some of the larger the driving assumptions that we had in the forecast was that pay would be at 2%. A 2% rise, so inflation on pay at 2%, and that CPI would be at 3.7%. Also in next year, as you would expect, we always anticipate a level of cost pressures, particularly across our care services. So we were anticipating that next year, all of our inflationary costs and pressures across our care and other services would require the council to put in a further £6 million worth of budget provision. Our forecasts were predicated on a 3% increase in council tax, and that is 2% for general purposes and 1% for the adult social care precept. We were also anticipating a further £1 million from what we describe it as the island deal, but the financial settlement to recognise the physical separation of the island from the mainland and the unique costs associated with that. We've already received £1 million, and we think that's on an ongoing basis, or it certainly is for the short term. And we're anticipating a further £1 million on top of that. So that's built into our forecast for next year. For all other services, we were expecting a cash flat settlement from government. So government funding for everything other than social care, we were expecting no uplift whatsoever. So obviously that's a real cut when you factor inflation in. And the other key thing that we were forecasting was that we would draw down on our general reserves by £2 million, and that was mainly to help us smooth out the impact of the £6 million deficit. But it does have the effect of reducing the council's overall financial resilience, because at a level of £9 million, we've only got £2 million headroom above our minimum level of reserves. So that's how we framed our forecast. If we turn to what's happened since then and what the financial environment looks like for us now, well, it's obviously, as you'll be aware, it's significantly different. We still have the continuing impact of COVID. So there are certain parts of the council and certain services that are still feeling the hangover from COVID. So particularly in social care and also in leisure, where there's been quite a drop off in the membership of our leisure centre. So I mean, in the current year, you'll probably have seen from budget monitoring reports that the financial impact of the COVID legacy in the current year is about £2.9 million. Now, we do still expect that to reduce over time, but there is a question mark over whether any of that COVID legacy will be permanent, particularly as it relates to those aspects relating to social care. We're in a high inflation environment, so you'll probably be aware that the National Pay Award has been agreed, and this is something that the council follows. The cost of that in the current year, so not even next year, the cost of that in the current year is 6.7%. It's a 6.7% increase on average. It's a flat payment to every individual of £1,925, but it is on average across the council 6.7% increase. That's significantly higher than what the council have budgeted for. The council budgeted for around 2%. And obviously there's a question mark about what that pay award will be next year as we continue to operate in a high inflation environment. And you'll see further down on the slide, so I'll attend to it now. You'll see further down on the slide that the consumer price index for the current year is running at around about, or it was in September, at 10.1%. It's currently 11.1%. But the expectation on average for next year is that CPI will run at about 5.5%, and they're the OBR's forecasts that came out in the autumn statement just recently. If we look at energy has more than tripled in cost, so it's adding to the inflationary environment that the council is operating in. And if we look forward to next year as well, the national living wage is set to increase by 9.7% from April. And again, that was announced in the autumn statement, and it has a particular implication for the council in relation to the amounts that are paid by the council to social care providers. So there's a lot of inflationary pressure still within the system and built into the system going forward next year. Obviously, as residents feel the impact of the rising costs of everything that they need to pay for, that does also have an impact on the council as well in terms of the demand that we get at the front door. So there's also in certain services there's greater demand pressures as a consequence of the cost of living experience that is being felt by residents. And to cap it all, we also have rising interest rates, which would make any capital expenditure that's funded by borrowing, for example, more expensive than we have been used to. So it will particularly make any of our investor save schemes, which require that we're able to fund the borrowing costs as part of that scheme, much more difficult to make viable. If we turn our attention to some of the areas now where we are facing what we would currently describe as unplanned or unbudgeted pressures. Now, these are not factored into the council's current forecasts, and they're a sizable amount. So £20 million of currently unbudgeted financial pressures. And I do want to labour the point here that we are at an early stage in the budget process, so it's almost feels a bit premature to be presenting the council's overall financial position at this stage, because we're going through the natural process of challenging, investigating, seeking to mitigate all of the budget pressures that we face. So this is first cut across the council of some of the budget pressures that we are likely to face and have to manage going forward. So you'll see that there's a large chunk of cost, both demand related actually in terms of number of care packages, but also inflation related as a consequence of provider care fees. So together they add up to well in excess of 9 million. The inflation on pay, now this relates to both the current year, so there's a hangover from the current year where we had a budget for pay that was not sufficient to meet the pay award, and our expectations of what pay might be for next year. If we add those two together, that could amount to around about £4 million worth of cost that the council has not factored into its forecasts. Core contracts, some of these will relate to our larger contracts, mainly around highways, PFI, the waste contract, and some of the other larger contracts. They often either link to RPI, retail price index, or CPI, the consumer price index. And as I've said before, they are running at high levels currently. CPI, as I said, is running at 11.1%. Energy cost inflation, everybody's probably aware of that, but energy costs over the last year or so have probably more than tripled in cost. And we also have some additional pressures around our looked after children. Some of that relates to cost and the cost of placements, particularly placements off island, specialist placements off island, but some of it also relates to people presenting at the front door. And I'm aware that we have at least a 30% increase in demand, I think, at the front door in terms of children in need. And you'll have seen this from budget monitoring reports before, and I've mentioned it at the top of the agenda, that we will have continuing pressure on our leisure income as a hangover from COVID. So whilst they don't all add up to 20 million, they are the drivers of some of the budget pressures that the council is facing, and will have to spend a lot of attention seeking to manage and mitigate as we go through the budget process. We turn to the autumn statement and just reflect on the extent to which we may have been provided with some relief as a consequence of the inflationary environment that we find ourselves in now. So that the first bit of relief that central government have allowed flexibility on is around council tax. So instead of capping, effectively having a 3% cap, which I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, which was 2% for general purposes and 1% for adult social care precept, they are now providing the flexibility to go up to a 5% increase in council tax. Now that's 3% for general purposes, so an extra 1%, and 2% for the adult social care precept, i.e. an extra 1% as well. So 5% in total. Just in cash terms, and you've heard me talk about £20 million worth of budget pressures. 1% increase in council tax, regardless of whether it relates to the adult social care precept or general purposes, is just over 0.9 million. In terms of social care, now this was the main story that came out of the autumn statement, which was the let's call it additional funding for adult social care. Now, in total for local government, it amounts to 2.5 billion. But the government were clear about this, that 2.5 billion doesn't all come from the government. Only 75% of it comes from the government in terms of grant. The expectation from government is that the other 25% will come from the adult social care precept. So that directly relates to this additional 1% adult social care precept that I mentioned previously when I was talking about council tax. So government's expectation is that all local authorities to receive that additional social care funding will have it part funded by government centrally and part funded from local council taxpayers. And I just break down the 2.5 million here so that you understand roughly where it all came from. 1.2 billion is new money, and it is new money, but as I said, some of that from government and some of it from the precept. The other 1.3 billion is as a consequence of the announcement to delay the social care reforms. So the social care reforms that were due to be implemented from October 23 are now delayed, and government are now redirecting that money that was for those social care reforms back into social care to deal with the current and existing pressures that all local authorities are facing. Excuse me. The rest of the autumn statement, particularly for local government, it confirmed what was that had already been stated in the comprehensive spending review that took place in 21, which said that the funding for all other council services will be cash flat, i.e. no inflationary uplift, and that in the current scenario means that there's a real cut of around about 10% if inflation pans out at that type of level. There is some relief in there because business rates, or the business rates that the council retains, are also inflation linked. So the retained business rates that the council receives will increase by 10.1%. But important to note that this accounts for less than a fifth of the council's funding. So it only accommodates, if you like, if you assume that your funding and your spending are in line with each other, it only provides relief for just under a fifth of your cost increases. The other main aspects of the autumn statement, not all necessarily related to local government support for households, but there's a fairly substantial amount of support for the cost of living measures. Now, some of this will be delivered by the DWP, for example, and not through local councils or through other mechanisms. But just as headlines, and some of this I've already mentioned, benefit cap will be increased by 10.1%, so that's inflation linked. The national living wage will increase from £9.50 to £10.42, which is a 9.7% increase. So again, close to the levels of inflation, and probably for those that are just beyond the benefits levels. Social housing rents, and that means for housing associations as well, actually, for local authorities and housing associations, capped at 7%. So those families and residents that are in social housing rented properties won't see an increase at the level of inflation. It'll be capped below that. There will be some cost of living payments through what's the household support fund. So households on means tested benefits will receive a £900 cost of living payment, pensioner households £300, individuals on disability benefits £150. And there's also an extension of the energy price guarantee. It's not at the levels that are currently experienced at £2,500 per household, but that will rise actually to £3,000 for a typical household. So some general relief there provided from government nationally. If we try to bring all of this together, you'll see there's lots of question marks in here, and that's just as a consequence of the fact that, as I said earlier on, we are at an early stage in the budget preparation process. So you'll remember that we started the year thinking that we would just need to find £2 million worth of still a significant sum. We'd have to find forecast savings in next financial year of £2 million. You've heard me talk about the unbudgeted pressures that I mentioned earlier, the 20 million. So assuming nothing else happened, we'd have a £22 million budget gap to address as part of next year's budget, which is obviously absolutely enormous. If we then turn to the relief that has been provided through the autumn statement, and I say again that we won't actually know how much of this money trickles down to local authorities until towards the end of December. But if we were to have a guess at what that might be based on our share of the national totals coming to adult social care, we think that could be in the order of 6 million. It could be more, it could be a little bit more, it could be a little bit less. But there's still a number of uncertainties in relation to that, in the sense that some of it might have terms and conditions attached to it. So exactly how that plays out, we're not entirely sure, but we do know that some of the government emphasis around this money is around discharge from hospitals. So potentially around 6 million. If the council taxes, and I think it has no other option to, given the state of the position that you see here, taxes for the extra 2%, i.e. the 1% extra for general purposes and the 1% extra for the adult social care precept, that would generate £1.8 million. And the business rates compensation I mentioned earlier on, that will be a 10% increase, amounts to 3.8 million. That figure actually will be adjusted, because that will be adjusted downwards, just as information comes through about the nature of the settlement, but we're anticipating that figure is going to be adjusted downwards to an extent. But if we added all of those things, if we added up the unbudgeted pressures to the original forecast savings, deducted the additional funding that we might receive, then we're at a position where we have a budget gap of about 10.4 million. Some of that relates to the COVID legacy that I mentioned earlier on, in particular leisure. We've got a COVID fund that we can use for that. So if we deduct that, then we're at about £9 million. So £9 million that we need to work through in order to come to the original position where we were effectively suggesting that we'd get to £2 million and a find savings for that and then balance the budget that way. So still a significant way to go for us in terms of on the budget process and the work we need to do to seek to manage that number down. So if I sum up on this page and then talk about what the plans are beyond, you've heard me say it, costs have risen sharply since the budget forecast was prepared. We are at an early stage and we'll continue to work through particularly the budget pressures. You'll see me come to that on the next slide. As I've said, we won't understand what all of the autumn statement means for the council until around about the third week of December. And also we won't be able to calculate what we think overall council tax income, and business rates income will be until around mid-January. So there's a number of things that we have to consider around that, not just the level of council tax increase, but also what the caseloads will be for local council tax support, how many single person discounts there will be, how many exemptions there will be. On the business rates side, it will be the extent to which we expect there will be appeals to business rates. There'll be collection rates to consider, both for council tax and business rates, all of which will affect business rates income, and all of which we won't be able to finalise our modelling and calculations for until about mid-January. What is clear, obviously, is that the government funding that we have received is not sufficient. It is way short of the current level of budget pressures that we are forecasting at the moment. It's also clear that even if you add in the tax increase as well, even that will not be sufficient in addition to the government funding to cover off the inflationary costs faced by the council. That all said, as a responsible council, we still need to plan for whatever eventuality may arise. So we can't wait for the outcome of the local government finance settlement at the end of December. We still need to plan ahead so that we are able to respond to any eventuality. So what should we do? Whilst it says here at the top, await the actual local government finance settlement on the 3rd of December, that doesn't mean wait and do nothing. That just means we need to see what it says, but in the meantime, we need to plan for whatever eventuality comes to pass. We obviously need to continue to press for the uplift to the island deal and the funding that may come along with that, particularly as we've assumed £1 million, a further £1 million. This third bullet point is absolutely critical, and this is the work that is ongoing over the next 4 to 6 weeks, which is we need to really scrutinise the budget pressures that we face and see how best we can seek to minimise or manage those. Now, at this stage, some of those pressures will be real and will be with us because we'll be experiencing them now. And some of them will be risks. So they're forecast to take place, but they may or may not happen at the levels that we are currently working to. I think we've got to at least plan for budget savings of around £3 million so that we've got a position where, depending on the outcome of the settlement and all of the work that we do around budget pressures, we've got a little bit more flexibility in order to attempt to arrive at a balanced budget for next year. There's an assumption by government that a levy for the social care precept will be at 2%. That's now our planning assumption, given the overall scale of the budget pressures that we face. And you may have noticed from the previous table or previous information in here that there's around about £13 million worth of social care budget pressures. Now that relates to both adults and children's, and the funding from government in terms of grant is just £6 million. So there's a £7 million gap between the pressures that we're facing and the funding that we expect to receive from government. And even if you layer in the social care precept on top of that, which is the extra 0.9 million, 0.9 million, we're still at least £5 million short in terms of cost versus funding. We're also making the assumption, as our working assumption now, that the council tax for general purposes will increase by 3%, particularly because inflation is running so high and the funding for all other services from government has been flat, so there's no uplift. And our advice at this stage, obviously, as we're in a position where we are still seeking to manage that overall budget gap, is that the council shouldn't be implementing any new policy decision at this stage that increases the financial burden on the council or draws upon any of its revenue or capital reserves, because there is a possibility that in order to balance the budget at the end, we might need to draw on certain reserves just to be able to make the numbers come together. And finally, if there are opportunities for the council to take decisions to improve its financial position, and that means either reducing or avoiding costs or increasing income, then the council ought to take those as soon as it possibly can. So I'll stop there. Obviously, I'm happy to take any questions, but I'm in your hands, Chair, in terms of how you'd like to take the next part forward.
Well, first of all, Mr. Ward, thank you for, as always, a comprehensive and clear presentation. On one of your early slides, you had the phrase low. Are you hearing me okay, Mr. Ward?
Yes, I am. Sorry, Chair.
On one of your earlier slides, you had the phrase low resilience, and I guess that comes into what your last slide was talking about in terms of budget reserves. Can you remind us of what the level you have set for kind of the minimum level of reserves before that might trigger perhaps actions from yourself? Can you just remind us what that sum is?
Yeah, the minimum level of reserves is £7 million. So if for example the council set a budget and it set that budget on the basis that its budgeted reserves for the year were 7 million, for example, it does cause complications as you go through the year when you're doing your regular budget monitoring, because at the point at which if you had a forecast overspend as you were going through the year and you couldn't offset that sufficiently, for example, with your annual budgeted contingency that's also in the budget, then you would then inevitably have to draw on reserves and your reserves would go below the 7 million. That's where intervention actions start to kick in.
Thank you. And amongst those is, I believe, something called a Section 114 notice or something like that. Am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, there is something called a Section 114 notice, and there's a prescribed procedure for that. But a Section 114 notice is effectively a notice that I serve on the council, and it will say something in the order of the council now needs to identify X number of savings in order to remedy its financial position, and it has to make decisions about how it would achieve those savings in the year in order to bring the council back to a position where its general reserves were intact at the £7 million level or more, and the council would have a certain period of time within which to identify that and come back and make a resolution on it. In the event that the council fails, then that could lead to intervention by central government and the appointment of government commissioners. They would do it through the vehicle of a best value inspection or a best value review, and use their powers then to put commissioners in place.
Thank you for that. The context, I just want to lay out the context before I open up to my colleagues for questions. Of course, from an audit committee position, we're not questioning the why of certain expenditures, and we're not a budget setting body, so we can't be dictating what sums are set out. But I do have in mind strategic risks 1 and 2, which we have a responsibility as an audit committee on the soundness of our risk register. Strategic risks 1 and 2 relate to lack of financial resource, and they impact both the in-year and medium-term final strategy. And also I had in mind an interesting little article I found that CIPFA had published about Section 114 notices and just what generally internal audit can learn from that. And of course, our internal audit colleagues, I'm sure, live and breathe and are somewhat always disturbed potentially about what they might have to learn from Section 114 notices. But our hope, of course, is that we're not in that situation, but lessons can be learned, and internal audit, of course, reports to members through this committee. So I just wanted to set up, this wasn't just me saying, oh, let's just have a presentation from Mr. Ward. It's actually for this committee to be properly cited and informed, and for the public to have seen that this body is paying attention to its responsibilities at this extraordinarily difficult time. Anyway, I'll open up to my colleagues, the Vice Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, as well, for your presentation. I'm much clearer now, so thank you for that. I think we do need to be very careful here, because this is exceptional circumstances, and I would think every audit committee of every local authority across the UK is actually having similar presentations and meetings. And I think we want to make very sure we do not alarm the public unduly by putting that into that this is a national crisis, right, which affects the Isle of Wight within that. And I think it's important to note that the recent leaders of Hampshire and Kent County Council have written to the government highlighting all the issues that have just been raised by you, Chris, from their contacts. And they are much bigger authorities with bigger reserves and much more durability. So if they are actually calling wolf, as it were, or raising issues, I think we have to put ourselves in that context. One particular, I mean, I've got probably several questions and probably some comments, but a particular question, Chris, is what we call roughly the island deal, right? I'm not sure you know what that is, but I mean, going back to the fact of many years that the University of Portsmouth made very clear that we had a deficit because of the water around us, and the fact that the actual government, after many years of lobbying from this council, did accept, or has accepted, that there is a difference, and did acknowledge that not to the full amount. Originally it was 6 million, but I would think it's much higher now. And if you think, if we got even 6 million extra from the government, that would put us in a different financial position. We're getting it seems to be a little bit more than that. Do we need to do what Kent and Hampshire have done, is, as a matter of due diligence and prudence, lobby very heavily the government now to say that as an island, with an accepted by you, the government, that we have a deficit because of our water around us, we are in increased exceptional circumstances because of COVID, UK, and to be honest, what you as the government have done regarding inflation and interest rates. Please, can we immediately have talks with ministers, urgent talks with ministers, about a future? I also link that there is now this island forum, which we were part of, and I would have thought other islands across the UK are also in difficult, exceptional circumstances. That's my question.
Okay, thank you. I'll have a go at see if I can unpick that a little bit. I think it's certainly important for us to press around the island deal, and I think from our perspective, we're likely to get greater success in terms of lobbying from the island deal as opposed to lobbying more generally about COVID, inflation, and government policy, because that's not unique. You know, that's general to every other local authority in the country. Where we have got something that's unique to us is about the separation of the island to the mainland and the unique costs that gives to public services in an island setting. So we certainly need to press on that, and we have provided much information to government way beyond the work of the University of Portsmouth. So we've done at least 2 other pieces of work that we've provided to government, and which we were in fairly advanced discussions with at cabinet office level until all of the reshuffles took place. So as you know, ministers and secretaries of state have changed quite considerably at central government. So we are now just navigating our way through the new set of, well, actually the new set of secretaries of state, in order to represent some of the work that we have produced, but obviously hasn't had a full airing at government yet, just because of all of the changes that are going on. So Wendy and I are doing that, and Laura is also doing that through her means as well. So that is something that we are pressing for. But I think the wider question of the other things that are affecting all other local authorities, that will come through loud and clearly from all of the I call them lobbying bodies, but all of the groups, including the county councils network, the LGA, and some of the other groups as well. So we should press at every opportunity, but I think the island deal avenue is the one that we should press most strong, is the one that's likely to have more traction than the other.
I'll come back, and I do have an idea for a recommendation proposal.
Councillor Luciani?
I won't take part in this part, obviously, because I'm part of the budget setting, but I'm a little disappointed that people on my left are not here to listen to this.
It is unfortunate, but as I outlined at the start, there are certainly a couple of people have given that. Sorry, leader of the council has indicated if she. Good morning, Laura.
Good morning, Andrew. Sorry, I wouldn't normally interfere and come in on this, but Chris is quite right. And actually, last evening, I actually wrote to Deanna, which is the Minister for Levelling Up. She has promised to come and visit us to the island. I am pushing for that because I think she needs to see for herself everything that is going on with the island. So just to back up what Chris is saying, we are really pushing because I feel this is the most important thing for the island for us to achieve. So I just wanted to come in. We are pushing. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for that. Councillor Love, you wish to make a comment as well. Just before I take you, just to note that Councillor Price, who had given apologies earlier, is able to join us now. Councillor Price, do you wish to declare any interest at this point?
No, thank you, Chairman, and apologies for being late.
No, you did explain to me though. Thank you, and I hope all is well there. Councillor Love.
Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to ask a question from the back. I too have spoken to our MP this week in comparison about the adult social care. In addition to the 10.4 million we've talked about deficit next year, have we? Could Chris Ward clarify what projections we might even in addition for this year's shortfalls, bearing in mind that my team's predicting, well, we've already had a declaration of a 1.6 saving next year. That's on top of the financial position which my teams would find absolutely impossible. I can say that absolutely now, that 1.6 is impossible to provide the kind of cuts that would be necessary. But does his accounts take into effect any overspills from this year that we might have to catch up as well in comparison to that 10.4?
Mr. Ward, I hope you caught that question. Are you able to respond at this time? Of course, cabinet members do have the luxury of being able to approach you at any time.
Yeah, of course.
But,
Yeah, of course. Yeah, the position that I outlined for next year includes all of the hangover from the current year carried forward into next year. So it's a I call it a full position for next year, but the caveat that I mentioned much earlier on, which is we're at an early stage of the budget process and we're working through all of these budget pressures as we speak.
thank you for that, Mr. Ward. One thing I would just note, in about 9 days' time, I have my usual meeting with the Chair of Corporate Scrutiny Committee. So I'm sure this will be a matter of our discussion there, because Corporate Scrutiny will have a very key role in looking at this situation from the other side of the coin. Councillor Lilly, though, I think you had more questions or even a proposal for us.
I think we've carried out our role in getting an up-to-date of the position. I think that the reality is, not all the information is there. And again, put the caveat, we are in a situation that other local authorities are in. So I think it's about allowing our teams and our cabinet to get all the information to be able to tackle these issues, and my heart goes out to you all, because it's not an easy scenario. I think the most relevant thing that's come from this is this issue about the island deal, right? And I think it is good to actually see that the Section 151 officer, the new chief executive, and the leader of the council are actually prudently taking action in that, because I actually think that is extremely important. The national things will, come out in the pot with everything else. But our case hasn't been ever so important now of the fact that we're surrounded by water and that our costs are vulnerable. I mean, particularly when you look at children in care, which was mentioned on there, we pay a premium compared to other people on the mainland, particularly to carry out our statutory duties of every 6 weeks. Officers have to go over, etc., visit the child, etc. These travel costs are not, way over what other travel costs would be in other authorities within that. And we need to really put our arguments, and I have every confidence in the officers and Laura and the cabinet in putting the detail of this, which you've done a lot of work over the years, as you confirmed, Chris, to actually say that as an island, we do have exceptional circumstances. I think we need to put pressure on our MP to really, put forward. He's a member of the ruling, party, to actually say we urgently need to get an island deal. So my proposal.
Before you do that, Vice Chair, I just will take Councillor Jones-Evans, who has indicated, and then I'll take your proposal. Councillor Jones-Evans.
Oh, thank you very much for taking me into your meeting. Apologies not there today. It was my point was actually Councillor Lilly's just mentioned it, is how the cabinet is working with our MP. We have regular meetings. We had one just last Thursday where the sole topic was really our finances. And, you know, he's already had a meeting with Deanna Davidson, the minister that our leader mentioned earlier. So we're continuing all that work that's being done with the island forums, which of course our MP kind of did start that off, you know, some months ago. So we are working closely. It is about the Isle of Wight as a whole. This is not political. This is just the people that have access, the people that can change our circumstances. It's using all of those channels, using all those relationships, and it's getting our message over consistently and not giving up. So that was really just, I wanted to put that in, that we, you know, we are working with our MP.
Thank you for that. Councillor Lilly, you had a proposal.
Well, my proposal was to recommend from this this committee that we support the leadership and the cabinet and officers in pursuing an effective island deal as part of really being prudent within our sort of planning of our future budgets within that. Is that got that wording? Sorry. I look for a seconder.
Councillor Price has seconded that. I think it is important to send those messages. I'm sure those messages are understood already, but having this through the formal processes just adds to that. So I'll put that to the committee. Those in favour, please show. That's unanimous. So I'll draw that item to a close. I'll thank again Mr. Ward for acceding to my fairly close to deadline request. Again, thank you for your comprehensive and clear presentation of the situation. I'm sure all members will be digesting that with some concern, but also some assurance that we do have you as an officer helping us steer that, and Kerry as well, steering us through what is the most difficult of times that I can remember in local government on the various councils I've served. So thank you very much, and you may now depart Tennyson down. Colleagues, thank you for bearing with us on that extensive thing, but as I said, I think that was very important that we do that. The next item on our agenda is the external audit planning report. It's pages 9 to 16 in the pack, and we have our external auditors again remotely joining us. So I can't read the names. Who's Jason will be doing so. Jones, thank you for joining us today. We have your report, but is there anything you'd want particularly to highlight to us?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning all. Chair, just it's a very short paper, and just one thing really to draw out of that report. In July, we issued an outline audit plan to the committee, but since then we've had the draft accounts submitted, and we've revisited our risk assessment, and then just made one change to our assessment of investment property valuations. So we've designated that as a significant risk, but all that means for the council really is that we will refer one of the investment properties to our property valuations team for review. We're not saying that it's wrong or anything like that. It's just the increase for between 2021 and 21-22 financial year was 6 million, and that's above our materiality, which is just slightly below 5 million. So that's the reason for that change, Chair. And then we've also just updated our materiality figures based on the draft set of accounts for 21-22, whereas previously it was based on the 2021 audited accounts. That were the only changes to our audit plan for 21-22, Chair. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that, colleagues. And any questions on this report? Otherwise, we should note it.
Put forward to note.
So is that noted? Yes, there are nods around. Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Chair.
Patience and for your contribution to this. By the way, I will just say now that I haven't forgotten that I need to send you a revised letter as well.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
You need to remind me of that. Very much. So item 7 is our internal audit progress report, pages 17 onwards in the pack. We have the Chief External Auditor here and the Audit Manager. Is there anything you wish to highlight to us?
Chair, no. I'm happy to take any questions. There's nothing significant from the work that we've completed since the last reporting period. There's nothing significant since the last reporting period, so I'm happy to answer any questions anybody may have regarding its contents.
Thank you for that. Also, my hearing is a bit blocked today, so if people are talking into their mics, can you bring it right forward to me? I think I may also be reaching that age where I need the attentions of medical specialists. Yes, so Councillor Love is indicating something that can be very helpful, and I may have to do that. Colleagues, any questions upon this? I certainly would note, I saw somewhere was one of the items which was noted. I just wanted to bring out the fact that the Omicron business grant fraud assessment had assurance as its level, and given obviously the difficulties of administering a number of things over the last couple of years relating to the COVID pandemic, it's really good to see that level of assurance around delivery of those things, where the council has had to step up to deliver sums of money in that way. So I hope I've understood that level of assurance in that way. But colleagues, any questions? Councillor Lilly.
I mean, overall, as you said, the position hasn't really changed. So that I just really wanted to note on page 36 where you got section 106 and final report reasonable, right? To me, as a councillor, section 106 is a mystery in a lot of cases, and often, you know, these developments come and you don't always see the sort of money necessarily going into that area or whatever. I was going to suggest that, is it possible that we as an audit committee could put forward to corporate scrutiny or the relevant scrutiny committee to actually just look a little bit deeper into section 106 and particularly this final report? Thank you.
Councillor Lilly, our item of work, which is presented in front of you, is that we would have performed a full audit a couple of years ago, and this is have the actions agreed out of that review been implemented. And this is really to say to you, there's still some work outstanding. When the internal audit team have a look at either 106 or SIL, depending upon what scheme we have, community infrastructure levy, we will look at whether the charging is correct, whether it follows back through to strategy or policy around this, and we'll do work around the detailed calculation to how we arrived at the charge to begin with. So this, to be honest, is a follow-up piece of work. I note that Chris Ashman is actually in the meeting. If there is further narrative around the actual scheme, that is probably going to be either one of the other committees, or it's going to be perhaps a personal conversation between yourself and an operative or an officer that deals with this particular area.
I do think perhaps it would be good, because I think it's very, you know, it's extremely important issue, and increasingly there has been quite a lot of feelings amongst the council regarding planning, right? And section 106 is a way of getting real mitigation and a benefit to the community. And I just feel it's not our role to do this, but I do think it's a role of perhaps a neighbourhood scrutiny committee to actually look that are we getting value for money in the sense of section 1 to 7, not necessarily from a financial point of view, but from of the use of this mechanism, which is important for mitigation of effects and building infrastructure around developments.
Certainly. I've heard that, as I said earlier. I've got the meeting with the chair of corporate scrutiny, so I'll certainly have a discussion with him as part of that, noting also what our chief internal auditor said. Doesn't stop any member from going directly to any member, any councillor or member staff on that. I did also note, obviously these are the short reports that we get, that under council tax and NNDR, there was a commentary around a need for a more robust approach. Are you satisfied that that robustness is coming in that approach in terms of the action plan underpinning this?
I am. I was actually going to say the director is here, Sharon Betts, and the service always engage with us. When we look at the sample testing, depending upon, it can be the luck of the draw regarding the cases that we actually review when undertaking the detailed testing. And sometimes if we have a higher hit, that's why it may come out as being a high risk, but very good engagement, good action plans. And I'll hand you over to Sharon.
Yeah, just to add to the Chief Internal Auditor's comments there, is that we did recognise that we hadn't been as timely in reviewing the discounts and exemptions. And as a result of that, we enhanced our system to put some different processes in place. And we've also taken on a dedicated officer to make sure that the annual reviews take place.
Thank you. That's very welcome to hear. And if I may, on payroll, there was a commentary around levers of retesting, identifying that actions that having been identified were not actually effective. How does things go forward when that in that case? Is there a further kind of process discussion?
There is. We, within the audit team, don't actually make the recommendations. If we identify that there is a gap, we sit down with the relevant service and ask, because they should be the experts in the activity, as to how they're going to mitigate the risk. In that particular instance, it was about communication and raising awareness, however, and that had occurred. However, when we retested, it didn't have sufficient traction, i.e. there were still a number of cases where there wasn't a prompt notification, and we ended up with perhaps an overpayment. We will go back at any audit if it's ineffective, and we need to have new actions to further enhance what should occur. Equally, we have to take on board that there may be occasions where you can't mitigate every single risk exposure, and there may always be a residual issue, but we'll put in place additional controls.
Thank you for that. Colleagues, any other questions? Otherwise, we should note this report. It's otherwise noted. Thank you very much. In which case, we'll move on to agenda item 8, the fraud and irregularity annual report. That includes whistleblowing. You'll note that it is a report both in the name of the Director of Finance and myself as chair. I guess some of that is because I am alerted to some matters to which this relates out with of these meetings and from time to time. So so it is as much in my name as Chris Ward's, but don't blame me for the wording. Presumably Kerry Hubbleday can pick up any questions relating to that and to the chief internal auditor. But anything you wish to highlight about this?
The one thing that I would highlight, and it actually feeds into Chris Ward's original presentation, is that very often the control environment, which is what internal audit test on a regular basis, we need to consider that pressures on any organisation may have an impact over a period of time on that control environment. And fraud and theft will be one of those things. So we will undertake enhanced checking to give the organisation some comfort that key controls are still effective. But I think it is relevant to flag to this committee that patterns are likely to emerge. We've come out the back of a pandemic. You have significant budget pressures. As most local authorities, we have cost of living, and that generally has an impact on behaviour, be it those that use our services or members of staff. And as I said, this particular report is really just detailing any cases that we've had over the last year, but I do want to gently flag that assessment we need to perhaps undertake additional work because we're likely to see an increase in activities of this nature.
Thank you. Colleagues, any questions on this paper otherwise? Councillor Lilly.
That's a question, really. I think it's just to highlight a point in response to what you've just said. I think it's important that historically whistleblowing has often been needed to be done, right? And because it's actually on the grassroots, isn't it? Is that it's often a person seeing a situation and seeing something that it's very difficult for a committee like this or others to actually see. So I just think it's important that message gets out there that people actually see something that is wrong. Then there is a mechanism to protect them very strongly in coming forward. Because years ago, I remember, I'm 65, I remember when people didn't do it because you would have lost your job. Not only lost your job, you probably never worked again. The whole point of whistleblowing and the legislation was to actually say, if there is something wrong, do not be frightened, right? To actually communicate it. And I think that openness and transparency, I think, is just very, very important, especially through difficult times, because that's when certain things can go wrong, isn't it, really? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from colleagues? Certainly, colleagues will have in mind, colleagues within staff will have in mind the point that you were raising around patterns and those things to watch out for. The flip side of that is that we must also make sure as an authority that that support which is available to people is very well communicated to them, so that any behaviour that's driven by desperation is headed off as far as we can. Obviously, in behaviour which is just directly criminal without any even slight mitigation can't always head off. And in any case, anything in this area, of course, must be dealt with within the same set of rules. Okay, colleagues. Otherwise, we note this report. It's noted. Thank you very much. Which moves us to the procurement half-yearly report. Anything you wish to highlight to us from that?
Thank you, Chair. No, nothing significant to highlight. Obviously, it's a standard activity report that comes on a 6-monthly basis. So hopefully you're all familiar with its content. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you for that. Colleagues, any questions around this? I guess it's we always see that issue of waivers. Does anybody wish to comment on whether or not they feel that ultimately we're on a downward path in terms of waivers?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. We have seen a decrease in this reporting period. I think you will note, however, that the waivers within adults and children's services have remained high. I think across the rest of the authority, we have seen a decrease quite significantly actually in regeneration, as you all know. And I think that is driven by a number of additional routes to market that have become available to us for some of our consultancy type services. So we were able to divert that through framework agreements, for example. But yeah, I mean, adults and children's, we've remained fairly static, but fairly high.
Thank you for that. I also have in mind some comments I made at full council a couple of weeks ago about the need for the authority to be able to act with urgency at certain times, given the difficult situations we are in. So I assume there may be circumstances in which waivers might see an uptick because of that need to act with some imperative. How do we sort of manage that to make sure that where possible that is the last possible, that's the last possible mechanism to use, that we've looked ahead and seen that we might need to do something with some urgency?
Yeah, I mean, particularly adults and children's, it is very last minute often. I mean, particularly adults, we have been impacted by hospital discharges. So sometimes it's factors beyond our control. I think it's good that it's captured and it's documented and it goes through that waiver process. So we do have that audit trail that everybody that needs to have eyes on it has had eyes on it. And that it's signed off in the proper way in accordance with our contract standing orders. Fairly similar for children's. Sometimes the waivers relate to the same individuals moving around. You know, sometimes they're fairly high need placements, and you know, they are off island. So again, they are often fairly urgent and need to be moved quickly. We document it, we have eyes on it, we scrutinise it. It goes through the council's officer procurement board, where it is scrutinised. Somebody from finance is on that one, chaired by Claire Shan, Director of Corporate Services. So I think we have good controls in place. The influence that we can have over where some of these waivers, particularly in adults and children's, come from is sort of fairly beyond our control. But I think it's positive that we do capture that and we document it and we have that audit trail in place, which sometimes is the best we can ask for there.
Certainly, I'd reiterate that point: the documentation, the trail, the understanding of how things happen, and that anybody wishing to understand that can see that it happened in a sensible and necessary way. Colleagues, any questions? Councillor Lilly.
I just wanted to come on to that. I think that, you know, thank you for the difficult job you've got, because particularly on the waivers, you're up against it, aren't you? And the providers often are very much in control, because you need them to say yes, right? And they will use their bargaining power in that circumstances. I think the concern on that area is the links to what Mr. Ward has said, in the sense that there's going to be increases because obviously the minimum wage and others with providers. And I think one of the things that perhaps, whether it's the role of the audit committee, but I think the message has to the word preventative, is we need to be looking at how the tap is stopped. Once the tap is on, it's in the market, isn't it? It's about looking at reductions of that. And actually, I'm quite pleased in other forums that the Police and Crime Commissioner, the police services, like our own service, the youth offending teams and things, and the children's services are all looking at alternatives and how we can reduce the reasons for people to come into the statutory realm where we have no say but to provide, quite rightly. But if we can reduce the numbers of people coming into the service, and I think that's where we should be really focusing on in the future. How this is what I've been saying this for years, really. How do we stop the tap or reduce the tap? You can't stop the tap, but you can reduce it so that we can establish relationships with the providers and not go through waivers this way. But thank you for. We're aware of it, and I think we need to be aware, and perhaps through to the children's scrutiny and adult social care, looking at the prevention side with that. Thank you.
The Chief Internal Auditor, you indicated.
Chair, could I ask a question?
You may, through me.
Could I ask whether we have seen any patterns emerging of contractors that are failing, i.e. their business are failing and they are withdrawing?
Good question.
Yes. Are we seeing any such pattern at the moment?
No, nothing significant to note. No, few price increases, you know, understandably based on the presentation we saw earlier this morning. I mean, it's not a surprise really, but no, not at the moment.
We are noticing elsewhere there are some contractors that are really struggling. There's no necessary pattern as to the areas of their expertise.
It's a very good question. I'm sure all colleagues will have that noted on their list of questions to ask next time. But Councillor Jarman, you wish to contribute?
Yes, thank you through you, Chair. My colleague, Councillor Love, might want to add as well. We have certainly seen some failures in terms of closures within the adult care sector. In Freshwater, we've had care home which is closed, which is now being redeveloped, I understand, as flats. We've had another one in Totland, a larger one, which is closed, both through economic viability issues. And we're not seeing too many new care homes opening, and that pressure continues. There are also a number of others which we understand are, you know, in some difficulty, and we need to continue to support them. But I think the measures we've got here, where you find waivers, they're a reflection of a growing crisis. It's a crisis of that increasing demand, certainly, but also of the processes not working. And you'll find on page 45, the figures spell out very well what the situation is. We note in paragraph 26 the issue of discharges from the hospital. And this is a failure of process here, where the capacity in the system simply doesn't exist, partly because of those care homes failing, and partly because of growing demand and the growing complexity of the people who are entering that system. And, you know, we do have a lot of, I know bed blocking is not the term we use these days, but we do have nationally a crisis going on in that industry. And if I was to look at the figures from 1 year ago to the present term in the table above it, you'll see that the comparison data for the first quarter and second quarter in 21-22 compared with the current one in adult social care, you know, the measures are quite dramatic rises, albeit sustained in the last short episode from 342,000 to 2.2 million coming through as waivers, and in the children's services from 1.3 million to over 4 million with those waivers. Now, those are short-term issues that need to be addressed. I'm not saying it's wrong that we do them. I'm just saying they are a reflection of the crises that we're seeing in those two industries. I don't know if Councillor Love wanted to add anything.
Councillor Love, you had indicated, so you want to add to that?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think Councillor Jarman covers off quite a lot of what I was thinking. I think a lot, there's no doubt about it that the sector is under enormous stress at the moment, and that we have had a number of, I won't call them failures, but closures of centres. I think a lot now depends on how we are able to manage the budgets moving forward, and depending on what the settlements are, because as Councillor Ward has already, as Chris Ward has already pointed out, and there are a number of pressures that are unknown to us, and we just don't know what that factor is. One is that wage rise. our teams are working incredibly hard to manage and mitigate against the pressures. The fact is that we are receiving, in terms of handovers, more complicated cases from hospital discharge, which require greater levels of support. And it's not just about the money element, it's actually about the staffing element of that and being able. So some care homes, whilst they are operating, have reduced their numbers of beds in order to manage. So whilst they remain open, so it kind of masks this, the issue slightly. We are working incredibly hard on that, but we can only do what we can do with the resources that we've got. Hence why, right at the very beginning of my term of office, we passed a motion to write to government to say we needed to fix adult social care. Unfortunately, what's happened from recent months in terms of government is that actually we were quite excited about having the 36 billion, I forgot what that figure was now, from Boris Johnson's government. Unfortunately, that's been pushed further down. That adds a pressure, so we're just trying to make sure that we maintain and manage that risk as best we possibly can. But it's the smaller operators that are struggling. Sorry, I've said too much. But
Certainly, there's a constant theme, isn't there, to today's meeting about the pressures and where those pressures are coming. And one thing that, again, I've echoed the words I had said at full council, this is not a short-term set of pressures. The acuteness is there, but this is going to be lasting for many years, if not for a couple of decades. This will ripple down through time on local government, in terms of services that we deliver, but ultimately, therefore, the impact that it will have had on the people to whom we deliver those services. Councillor Lilly, did you wish to? I think you may have had a.
I just think we just need to note that the various pressures on the public sector then sort of go down to the private sector, the independent sector, and the voluntary sector, who we rely on extremely in delivering the services to provide the necessary services to the people in need, whether they're children or adults. And I think and I know we are as a council, but there's a dialogue, isn't it, with all the stakeholders that needs to be how do they survive this this storm, really? Because if we were talking about the waivers, if they get knocked, right, then the market gets smaller, and people then can charge more money, and we will have no other choice. So it's a sort of vicious circle that we have to recognise, and we are recognising, but we do need to be having that dialogue or narrative. Again, coming back to the island, if our providers on the island go to the wall, then actually that really affects us, because then we have to send everybody to the mainland. I mean, an example of this was still being resolved, the Shackleton ward for Alzheimer's at St Mary's. Hopefully that's coming back, but at the moment, everyone that level that needs a Alzheimer's ward in the NHS has to go to the mainland. So I think it's just, we need to conscious, and it comes back also making this case to the government,
indeed,
to say that the reality to us is harder than mainland authorities who can go down motorways and things. We can't, and actually the other point is our ferries, right, and our transport are making it worse, because they're not necessarily in evenings, and quite often they are not being able to maintain the service, and ferries are coming out, which is affecting us seriously, which is adding to that, which needs to be part of the case to the government.
Indeed. Councillor Jarman, and then I think I'll wrap this item up.
Yes, just to add that when we do look at these figures and we look at them, over a number of years, we have to remember that those pressures are compounded year on year. So if I take one of the additional pressures, which is a legacy of COVID, really, within the care sector, you'll find that there was a COVID premium paid for people within the care sector. And the danger, of course, is that some of these figures get baked in to future elements. So there's clearly a reluctance for the care sector to take figures which don't include that premium now, because it's an expectation that's been set. The same is true of the other costs, whether it's the pay that we provide and the remuneration packages, or whether it's the automatic uplifts that come into many of the contracts, that once they are baked in for this year, next year we not only have that the increase, but the increase is on the increase of this year. So we have a rapidly accelerating compounding effect away from where we'd expected to be. So an average of 2% per year can become a 10% plus 10% compounded plus, and you can see the divergence becomes massive within a very few years. And that's really what drives this inflationary spiral. And that's the danger, I think, that we face at the moment.
Thank you for that. We've had a full discussion on perhaps a more wide-ranging discussion than you might have anticipated on a report of this nature, but it is important. Colleagues, we're invited to note the report. I recognise that we note a lot, but anybody looking in from outside should note that our narrative, our discussions do probe on these things. So although we are noting, it is not a passive approach. But that said, do we note the report? No. It is noted. Thank you. Which moves us to item 10. It's the Treasury Management Report, Quarter 2. Anything to highlight to us?
Thank you, Chair. I'm not going to go through the details of the report because I know you've all read it and inwardly digested it. I just wanted to identify a few things that have happened since the report was actually written. As the report's actually written, is presented to us as a template from our investment advisors. It's obviously has a fixed date, and since then we've had a few issues, as I'm sure you're aware, that have happened. One of the main ones is the Bank of England increased their interest rates to 3% in early November. They've actually got another meeting set in the middle of December, and the market is actually anticipating that the rates will increase again to 3.5%. According to this, Arlene Close have actually looked at their forecast rates, which is actually shown at the bottom of the appendix of the report. And they have changed the peak to 4.25%, peaking in June 23, rather than the 5% forecast that they had included. Essentially good news, but I think it's that is subject to change. I will say that. But what this will have, obviously, is there is an ongoing effect on the future short-term cost of borrowing and any long-term borrowing as well, if we have to undertake any. We're not actually anticipating to have to borrow again until towards the end of this financial year, though, of course, as I'm sure you're probably all aware, any form of forecast has elements of flexibility in it, and so I just keep an eye on that on a regular basis.
Thank you for that. So certainly I'd echo that point about projecting forward. It's always within a kind of a confidence envelope as to the degree to which you believe the trajectory is travelling, and anybody who follows the Bank of England will see that they have a fan chart, it's called, I believe, which shows their degree of confidence around certain sorts of things, and the actual line that then tracks through all of that after the fact sometimes is not within the confidence envelope, certainly in the last 2 or 3 years. Councillor Jarman, I know that this report is also in your name. Is there anything you wanted to add to this?
I just want to reiterate the thanks which are due to the team that managed this. And I don't think that's said enough. There is a key issue which I'll bring out at the top of page 64 here. You'll note the first paragraph here that the actions here have resulted in a net saving of 2 million. Now, when we hear the other pressures that we've got, that is not an insignificant change in where we thought we'd be. And then to call your attention to page 70, which I think is one of the more important pages here. Sorry to pull out some of the detail, but I like detail. You will see that in the Treasury Management Summary, we talk about our borrowing figures, and our borrowing figure now is down in terms of total borrowing 11.3, and in terms of the net figure 8.8 again. These are quite substantial changes. Now, largely, of course, this is because we've been cutting our cloth to suit our means and actually spending less. But to see these changes being reflected in our borrowing figures is very rewarding indeed. And that net impact in terms of our expenditure is very important. So I think a hearty congratulations here to the team are very much in order.
So, and certainly I'd echo that. Councillor Lilly, I believe you have an interest you wish to declare.
Need to.
Sorry, I haven't got mics on.
So, just to note that I am a member of the pension board, right? And in that, I didn't declare that at the beginning. I do have a question which our section 151 officer basically made the point about it's important not to commit ourselves, right, to increase costs, particularly, and he mentioned borrowing, right, within that. This council committed itself to borrowing, particularly regarding housing, right? In the light of this circumstances, in a sense, from the advice, we need to hold that off for the moment because until we've got all the facts and everything, because obviously the rate we would be borrowing is much higher than what we actually predicted. Is that correct? I mean, there might be other borrowing other than that. I'm just mentioning that very clearly in our budget last year for this year was an amount of money to borrow, right? But particularly to do with housing.
So yes, there was a figure which was a multi-year figure, which was in the budget for last year with a relatively small element to be in this year's budget. Clearly, actually taking advantage of those sums is dependent on the business proposition that comes forward. And that business proposition will now have to address the fairly substantial changes that we've seen in terms of borrowing rates. However, I think the challenge is also reflected in the marketplace in that we're seeing, quite seismic shifts within the housing market. If I go back 3 months, there were some 1,200 properties for sale on the island. There's now about 1,450. So 1,200 to 1,450 is quite a big increase in properties for sale. We've not seen any easing at all in the challenges, however, for the rental sector. So renting remains very, very difficult and precarious. And indeed, the prices are extortionately high. Unfortunately, they will probably remain so. So it is beholden on us, I think, as a council, to do everything we can to keep people in rented accommodation where it's available and not to overstress their financial situation that would drive them out of that. And secondly, to do everything that we can as a council to make sure that we provide them with quality housing and a secure roof over their heads. So those are not always easy elements to balance given the stresses that we've got and the borrowing rates we've got, but we cannot stop. I don't think these are issues that we can do nothing on. We just have to be very mindful of the business proposition and how we frame that business proposition when we bring it forward.
I think certainly, I think if I may, I'd sort of comment that there are lines of questioning there that would be best taken through scrutiny rather than necessarily through audit. So those who are also on scrutiny, notwithstanding the best practice of not having any scrutiny members on this committee, want to see that press forward. Again, I'll be having a conversation with Councillor Quigley, Chairman of the Corporate Scrutiny Committee, and I think that's something I'll certainly want to raise with him, that he may want to direct some questioning down those lines as well. Any other comments or questions on this paper? Otherwise, we will note it in the usual way. And thank you very much for it. It's now a quarterly report, of course, isn't it? So, which is illuminating to us. And I agree with Councillor Sharman. I do love a bit of detail, especially when there's a number. Right. That moves us on to item 11. It's the council's risk profile, pages 79 onwards in the pack. We have Debbie Downer here. What I've first will highlight to the committee, this is one of those reports where I get advance sight of it. I will bring up, after Ms. Downer's had a chance to comment, some of the areas that I raised issues around, just to get it into this public forum, that there has been change from draft through to final report. But any items you'd wish to highlight to us at this stage?
I don't think so. Again, this is one that the committee is used to seeing in this format. So what you'll see is a refresh on the mitigations and the pressure points as it comes through. At this point in time, there's no new strategic risk going on, although we are looking at wanting development around the cost of living crisis. We have undertaken impact assessments with the service areas, and that at the moment is with the Chief Exec and the Section 151 officer to understand and agree which is the best way to report that going forward. But more than happy to take any questions or queries.
Thank you for that. And I'll just reiterate that you're looking at this development of a further strategic risk around cost of living, which is quite obviously going to be needed as something taken out of where it might otherwise be embedded in other strategic risks. Just for the record, I will identify that, so you'll find that on page 98, there's some discussion around safeguarding under strategic risk. That was an area I highlighted that I felt there was more narrative needed around that area, and I'm grateful to those the staff who put that narrative in there. I have raised some concerns around what was it, page 100, I believe it was, around the daily monitoring of the occupancy levels. There's a bit more narrative under strategic risk 12 relating to the hot commissioning of the waste facility in my ward, I note, which we continue eagerly to wait to see coming properly on stream. And sorry, there was rather a lot, wasn't there? I must have been in a grumpy mood that day when I read through these things. So I did note that the concern around on page 105 at the bottom of the page, the level to which directorates engage with risk management reporting being variable. I'm sure the now formally the chief executive rather than the interim chief executive will want to redouble her efforts in that area just to ensure that that variability is an acceptable level of the variability. Variability can still be adequate. So, but on that, and I did also note a continuing sort of commentary around on page 110 around the business continuity plans. Ms. Downer has sent me a note around that relating to highways. Which one have you sent me? Remind me, it's Highways PFI one.
Highways PFI and the waste contract, those two.
Both of them, yes, you have. So those should be in place. They've been long running, I think, on our reports before us, and it'd be looking forward to that narrative disappearing from the risk register.
Chair, if I might, it's probably worth reiterating the fact that whilst the internal template, we have an internal business continuity template that emergency planning team help us put together. Both of those contracts in terms of business continuity arrangements with the contractors are in place. So we have no issue there. It's our internal document that they are now working on.
But it's good to see that this will probably disappear off the off the narrative, or I hope it would, by our next meeting, which I believe is March. So sometime there to get through that. Colleagues, questions or comments on the risk register? Our purpose here is to confirm that it remains kind of fit for purpose, basically. And certainly, in the time that I've been chair, I've noted the development of the way it's been presented. I do find it much more satisfactory to me, and I'm hoping therefore that is reflected through cabinet and through staff, that they are finding it easier to work with, particularly at that corporate management team level. Colleagues, any questions? Councillor Lilly.
It's not a question. I think it's the comments is, I think some of the things that we have discussed right today are very clearly in this document. And I suppose that's what we need to sort of check, really. Are our concerns that we've raised here in the document, and it's quite comprehensive. So I'm not going to ask further questions, because I think we've highlighted the ones that we have concerns with, and they're being dealt with.
Thank you. In terms of that cost of living risk coming forward, obviously our next meeting as an audit committee is March next year, but do you anticipate completing the work in its development and therefore its kind of implementation before then?
There's currently a draft that's sitting with the Chief Executive and the Section 151 Officer of Strategic Risk. I think part of the request to our corporate management team is also how we best brief the audit committee on that. And that might be an informal brief rather than waiting till the next meeting, if that's okay.
That was going to be my next point, my next question. I think the committee would benefit in some way or another to being briefed upon it at the earliest opportunity. It's going to be the issue itself is so important that that particular risk and the mitigations that go with it are going to be very, very important. So as soon as you are able to, we will convene some form of meeting, probably electronic, to allow people to be briefed upon it and make comment. Otherwise, if there are no other comments or questions, then the option here is that we do actually take an action here. We don't just note that we agree that the strategic risks as set out in Appendix 1 be approved. Do we approve that? I'll move that from the chair. Do we approve of those in favour? Thank you. Those are approved. And thank you again for the engagement that I have as chair. Sometimes my comments are robust, but hopefully helpful in the end. The next item would have been a written report from me as chair at the annual report, an annual report that would actually be the first for a number of years, partly because, well, obviously because of COVID. So the decision had been made not to attempt to report on that. I had a written report very much in draft, very close to submission to Democratic Services. And then I noted some updates from, was it from SIPFA in October of this year, which I had not properly digested. So I feel that it'd be better for us as a committee to actually collectively look at those and see how we meet the various points in what they say is best practice. I do believe we have a good story to tell. We do have a framework within which we work successfully in terms of our terms of reference and constitutionally. The Vice Chair and I recently met electronically with the audit team to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the committee. Overwhelmingly, I felt that I think we had concluded, Vice Chair, that there were strengths, a couple of areas in which we needed to look at things to develop ourselves and our skills. Also, the input that we have. One thing we do note is that we should look again, and it's against it for guidance as well, that an independent expert input into this committee that would be very, very good. And I've also kicked off with our external auditors conversations between myself and them directly on a bilateral basis, which will be ahead of each meeting of the committee. And my I took the first one about a week ago, 10 days ago. That was very helpful, mostly me asking them, do be frank and tell me how I could be a better chair. And I've asked for some examples of where I can go and look at where they have identified very good chairing and very good audit committee engagement. So I'll be looking at that and reporting back to you. But the next meeting will be very much open to all members of the committee to engage with our external auditors and have that kind of free and frank exchange of views under the Chatham House rule almost, just so that we can develop ourselves as a committee. Because I know we may not be seen as the most exciting committee, but we are one of the most important committee. So I think that's enough in terms of a verbal update from me, but just to confirm that will be coming through for March next year. Again, a verbal progress report from me, a very short one. I do maintain a dialogue with the monitoring officer around the review of the Constitution. The main point, of course, is around the report from the planning peer review. I understand from those who are engaged and involved in that is going forward pretty well. Of course, it has to report through us as audit committee, formally constitutionally obliged to look at any recommendations for changes to the Constitution, which we would then report through to full council for their actual consideration and adoption or otherwise. That doesn't stop any member, of course, of this committee or of the council going to the monitoring officer and making suggestions otherwise on things that might be changed within the Constitution, either to radically overhaul it perhaps, or just merely to make things a little clearer as to how we do our business. But I'm satisfied that the planning side, or certainly from what's reported to me, is going forward fairly successfully. Which you may indeed.
Just in that regard, I still think we have to emphasise the importance of getting a report, to members of the full council to actually make those changes, because it does mean every planning committee meeting that actually happens, right? We still have anomalies between the consultation and the law. And I think we just need to note that. So that's not going to go away. That literally goes every month to a planning committee in that regard. And I just think we shouldn't get complacent about it, even though I think there is progress. There was progress at the last full council to do with the island plan. At least, there was a majority decision, well, an inclusive decision on the things that need to be resolved with that. So yes, I support the fact of that, but I don't think we should have complacency on that, because this issue of these anomalies have been there for a long time, and every meeting we're vulnerable, to appeals and things and whatever, until we actually get that alignment in place. Thank you.
Certainly, I don't get any sense of complacency. It is just taking its time, and unfortunately, the nature of the way in which we have.
I'm not saying complacency. There's a danger. A danger.
But I wanted to make sure that there is, whilst that danger may be there, it is not being realised. So, and because of our constitutional requirements, it has to come through audit before it can go to full council. So there's nothing to stop us having an additional audit to deal with it if we felt that would expedite matters, I guess. So I'd have to explore that with the monitoring officer and democratic services if need be. Otherwise, item 14 is our work plan. Two things, obviously there's a lot of work here that we do have in the coming months. Two things I'd like to highlight. One, colleagues, you will have seen an email come from Democratic Services about meeting times and dates for committees. I flagged up with Democratic Services that it would be good for us to look at our meeting time at least. That Monday 10 o'clock is difficult for a number of members, and so your thoughts as to whether we should push towards something more like 5 o'clock on a Monday, if that would be helpful, or indeed another day, although it suggested to me, but please to avoid the middle of the week, Tuesday to Thursday. And I, for one, certainly wouldn't want to be meeting on a Friday afternoon at 5 o'clock, much as I love audit work. So we're probably looking at a Monday. It would be for the new municipal year. So our next meeting in March would still be at that 10 o'clock time. But if you've got thoughts, do just get in touch with me and let me know as to what would be a much better time. I am aware, of course, that for members of staff, evening meetings do have a downside that it's somewhat outside of your working day. So your comments as well would be just as welcome. So, for example, Chair should crack on with the meetings a bit more. Councillor Lilly.
I just want to say my preference, especially with a busy diary in evenings, 10 o'clock on a Monday is much better for me. So as a committee member, I'd like it to publicly to say I'd prefer to keep it as it is.
I will hear, I'm sure, counter arguments from other colleagues as well. And certainly we can look at day of week as well, if that would be helpful. The other matter is around the floating bridge. So I've been in touch with the Chief Internal Auditor around the matters of the floating bridge decision making from a governance perspective. It's not to open up that or attempt to open up something that is closed, but there will be some things that I think we potentially could learn about how we found ourselves in the situation we were in and the nature of the decision making process. And I had a very good line of thought earlier, didn't I, as to why this was important, and it's just completely gone from my mind. So a nudge on my memory might be helpful from you, Chief Internal Auditor. What was it I said?
I'd love to, but it's gone from mine as well. So I'm going to fail you miserably. I'm terribly sorry.
It was in terms of our relation. It's more about in terms of our relationships with those bodies that provide funding, and the way that they look at us as an authority and have assurance from us as to the way that our processes work. So. It's certainly felt to me, and I had the discussion with the Chief Internal Auditor around this. I've also had a discussion about the actual sum of money. Of course, that cannot be disclosed. It's the nature of the agreement. It does have to appear in some way in our accounts, and I have raised that both internally and with the external audit as to how that's happening. And I given assurance that they are having the appropriate discussions that would to ensure that it would be reported properly, but at the same time lawfully within the realms of the non-disclosure agreement, that it's not an identifiable sum of money. So, but I will leave that at this stage. Although, Councillor Price, you wish to say something?
Thanks, Chairman. Yeah, I wouldn't have brought up the floating bridge if you hadn't mentioned it, and I don't want to open that wound that just won't heal. But the criticism has been regards the confidential agreement, which I think anyone really can process why there's a non-disclosure agreement in place. I just wonder whether it would help and whether it would be possible in the future, not for this committee, but perhaps an all-member confidential session that would allow that information to all members confidentially under a further non-disclosure agreement would actually take away some of that discomfort that the council is seeing, but also reassure members of the public that at least their local representative has had sight of what that settlement was, even if we cannot discuss it any further. Thank you.
And certainly, I'm sure that's something actually that Councillor Quigley, I know he's exploring his rights to that information. As the occupier but one of the chair that he had, members will know that I had sight of matters relating to the Highways PFI contract under extreme confidentiality. So that may be something he would wish to explore as to whether or not it is possible to open it to all members. I would personally think it is very, very unlikely, but certainly if I may speak just as a member of the council, if I knew that Councillor Quigley had looked into that and gave me his personal assurance of his satisfaction, that would add to my greater comfort on that. But certainly a line of discussion, again, I might pick up with Councillor Quigley in a few days' time. Councillor Lilly.
I think we have to be the reality. Scrutiny committee regarding the highways, the PFI contract, was all given an opportunity to sign a very thick legal document before we could actually see anything. And in the end, I think only 2 members actually agreed to sign it, because within that, I think you at the time as chair of corporate did see it, and that gave some reassurance. But it is one of those things that perhaps needs to be explored. But the reality of it is, do members want to actually sign a legal document which actually means that they could lose their homes, right, if they actually spoke out of line? Because that's the bottom line reality, is they will be sued. And I think as members, we all be concerned about that. So I think that yes, we should explore ways, and I think you're doing it properly through corporate scrutiny, but we just have to be realistic. We work in a real world. I personally don't like NDAs. Over the years in different hats, I've had to sign them because that's the only way to move forward with it. We wouldn't get a deal unless that was signed. I think the key is the chair of scrutiny be able perhaps to come back and say, in the circumstances, that was probably a reasonable deal. But whether Councillor Quigley wants to sign a legal document that thick, which is what you're actually talking about on non-disclosure, is another question. I personally wouldn't. I admire you for doing it.
It wasn't quite as thick as that, but certainly I was requested as chair of corporate scrutiny too, and I did sign. Therefore, was able to gain some comfort from the information that I was cited on. That will be for Councillor Quigley, but I'll communicate that back, point that Councillor Price was making, to him as well. And I'm sure our Democratic Services Officer will remind me of all the things that I'm going to be raising with him then. Otherwise, the last item is members' question time. Are there any questions from members? You've lost your chance because I've decided to say I haven't seen any. Oh, just in time. Councillor Jenny.
It was just a very quick question. How are we doing on getting any other members? I hate to use the word independent because I'm an independent councillor, but independent of the councillors on board.
We're at the start point of that. Vice Chair and I, when we discussed this with the internal audit team, identified it as something we wanted to explore. And so Councillor Lilly and I will work with them on how we do that. And making sure that we've identified through the skill set of the committee what it is we might be feeling that we're lacking. There is also it's the Redmond review. Am I right in remembering that has certain comments about whether or not there might be independent chair, full stop, I think.
It's making it, it's firming up, isn't it, that audit committees have to be kind of mandatorily or statutorily, and regarding the independent, that yes, you should be going down that particular path. But I think your link into, as you say, where the skills gaps are, will also inform what path you attempt to go down. You have attempted to go down independent route over several years, but that was a number of years ago. So.
And the other thing is to just note, and I've discussed with the Alliance Group leadership and with the Conservative Group leadership how we can fill the gap that we have, but also fill the issue of that the timing as we see is making it difficult for Conservative members, I know, particularly to attend. But Councillor Lilly.
Well, in the light we now have a new Lib Dem group, we perhaps need to ask them whether they would like a place.
I will have a conversation with the leader of the Liberal Democrat group at some point. I am aware from the leader of the Liberal Democrat group that he's awaiting, he will be seeking and awaiting some guidance as to the degree in which proportionality will provide for opportunities for additional spaces to be taken up. And personally, I'd be delighted if new Councillor Stewart were able to join this committee. I think he would bring immense contributions to this. So if that is an opportunity that A, is open to us, and B, is something he's willing to do, then you may find that the Liberal Democrat group may be looking to take a place on additional place on this committee. But obviously that depends upon the monitoring officer's advice around proportionality arrangements. Councillor Price.
Yeah, actually, as it was pointed out about Conservative members, I think it's worth pointing out, and I can also update you that I've had a message from Councillor Redrup and Gary and Councillor Pease to say they've both been called into commitments at work. All three of us run our own businesses. I know many other people do on the council, but Monday morning is a particularly difficult part of anyone who runs their own business's week. You know, an added issue with taking my mum to an appointment this morning. But so it is difficult. I appreciate none of us want to spend more evenings out than we have to, of course, but it may be maybe changing the day of the week would be helpful, even if it's not till later in the day.
Absolutely, it was no criticism. It was actually to note that I do know that all three of your situations do make it very, very difficult. Personally, I'd love it to stay at 10 a.m. because I'd have to give up work opportunities, but I have the luxury of having an allowance, and so I realise that displaces any financial need in my case. But we shouldn't see others put under that too much pressure, given their work commitments, because obviously local government service is over and above our daily lives as well. And I look forward to being strong-armed by the Vice Chair. Anyway, thank you very much for your attendance this morning and into the afternoon. If there are no other members' questions, I will close the meeting at 12:07 by my watch.